direct war with Iran in the Middle East. And in my opinion, they did everything to put an end to this conflict between Israel and Iran. And Antony Blinken was trying to do that. And on the other hand, we're hearing from the Republican Party, Donald Trump and his pick for the vice president, J.D. Vance. Both of them are talking about that we are not interested in having a war with Iran in the Middle East. Doesn't matter how much Israelis are pushing for this type of war. And how about who's benefiting from this attitude that Iran is our ultimate enemy in the Middle East? We have to go to war with Iran. And everybody knows what has happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and who was behind the conflict in Iraq. And right now, it seems the same kind of people are pushing for the same kind of policies that led to that disaster in Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's right, Nima. The problem is that Israel, the Israeli leaders, the ones in power, and their affiliates in Washington, the ones in power in Washington, are joined at the hip, and they are in power, so to speak. In other words, the U.S. government is not unanimous here. Tony Blinken has been able to assert his will, even to the point of lying to Congress, denying that people in Gaza were being starved to death. My God, when major people, including U.S. institutions like the U.S. aid agency, were saying, of course they're being starved. They're not letting the trucks in, for God's sake. And every day, more and more people are starving there. So Tony Blinken lies about that. So we have, in my view, two factions. The ones that are really, really Zionists, par excellence, and they have Biden's ear, who also styles himself as the arch Zionist. Sullivan, maybe a little bit less so, but he's Jacob Isaiah Sullivan, if I remember, Jeremiah Sullivan or something like that. He's got roots in Israel as well. So there are those against the people who have served in uniform, the few people who know about war. Not many of our leading generals and so forth really know about a real war, but they know what it would be to make a real war against Russia, and they're putting the restraining cords on. After it's a sad history, but after Putin came into office in 2001, he reached out and said, "Hey, let us join NATO." I mean, there's no real. We have no military, to speak of. And he kept being rejected. And in 2007, he said, "All right, well, we'll give it a real good try." I remember the photos at Munich at the Security Council. There's Bobby Gates and other people smiling and smirking. "Oh, yeah, right. You Russians are going to do something. You're flying their back. You can't do anything." Well, Putin was as good as his warnings. And as he warned a couple of years later, we're not going to try to build systems that don't work. I mean, you build systems that don't work because there's lots of people make lots of money from systems that don't work, like ABM systems. Okay, you might remember that back in 1972, we realized that, at least we Russians did, says Putin, ABM systems can't work. There can always be a counter system developed to get through that. Those you can't shoot down 1,000 missiles at the same time, okay? And we can do that, okay? So we stopped, says Putin. We stopped building an ABM system, and we developed things like hypersonic missiles and all manner of other things, strategic as well as tactical, that go really fast, really, really fast, and carry quite a payload. And I think it was 2018, Putin, in a very rare address, it was the State of the Nation address, like the State of the Union address here. He did a little slideshow, and he said, "Okay, this is what this missile can do, and this one goes around the South Pole. Okay, so here, build a ABM system against that, and this one does." It was like he was selling these missiles. Well, that was not 5 years ago. That's 9 years ago, or whatever. Okay. Yeah, 8 and 2 and 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And they built those things. Okay. And we know what hypersonic missiles are. And the oddity is, the unexplainable reality is that the US has not been able to develop those kinds of missiles. Maybe all the really smart people are working on these F-16s, which may not be all that stealthy anymore, besides not being able to work very well in, in the dark or in a rainstorm. So, yeah, it's a long story, but the missed opportunities here are what cry out for explanation. And the reality is that Americans have been deprived of all this for the last decade because our media has been molded by the people who own our media, and those are the same people who are war profiteers. They all work for the same boss. And, if you look at what percentage of their income comes from their media enterprise, well, maybe only 5% because paired with F-35, but my God, it works. There are no alternatives except, as I say, and I hope you make it to 500,000 too, Nima, people like you.
Ray, the other thing would be the conflict in Lebanon. Do you think that the reality of what's going on in Lebanon gonna get into the mind of Israeli people at the end of the day? Are we heading toward that moment?
I think we're heading toward that moment, Nima, but all too slowly. Uh, as I read it, the Israeli population has to realize that this is not a good idea to exact vengeance for October 7th on an entire population in Gaza. And that war in Gaza has not been successfully concluded. Now they're trying to starve most of the people in northern part of Gaza. Well, that may work maybe for another week. We'll see what happens, who wins the election. But to let people starve to death when the food is waiting at the gates to come in is something that civilized nations probably won't allow for much longer. So it seems to me that after a while, vengeance will recede, poverty and relocation. Those 60,000 or so folks that used to live in northern Israel are settlers. They can't go back to their homes, and Netanyahu is not going to be able to make it so that they can. Gradually, they'll come to the realization this was a fool's errand, and worst of all, if people come in the United States and say, look, we gave you everything you needed, you're on your own now. As unlikely as that appears at this point, who knows? The Israelis really have to be afraid of that. So I see change coming, but only when the Israeli people, as well as the Israeli leaders, realize that the game is up and that they've lost definitively, and the only thing left to lose is support from the U.S. If they keep going out on a limb, they might lose that too.
We know that the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, today he was talking about that they're prepared to fight against Israel for the weeks and months to come. And on the other hand, it seems that in Israel, they're talking about that we're winning with those assassinations. And right now in the southern part of Lebanon, they're trying to convince their people that they're winning in southern part of Lebanon. Do you think that Israel is benefiting from those assassinations, or we are witnessing the same Hezbollah that they were fighting Israel for years in the southern part of Lebanon?
Well, first, I'd add the remarks that Naim Qassem made today. He also said we're willing to negotiate. We're willing to talk with Israel as long as the terms are fit for us as well. So he's doing both things. And in answer to your basic question, no, it makes no difference how many Hamas leaders, how many Hezbollah leaders you kill. There are always people to take their place. All it does is make it worse for the Israelis over the long term, because all these people become martyrs, and martyrs have a special appeal to people who believe that if they fight for their justice, for their fight for their independence, that they deserve a special place in heaven. I mean, after all, a lot of my Irish forebears felt the same way when the British occupied and abused the Irish population. Many of them perished, not only in battle, but in the artificially kept famine. So I come from a history where people, my great grandparents, survived the famine, but the ones before that did not. Okay. And many of my uncles were fighting in the IRA, and it wasn't until just a few decades ago when that stopped and there's prospects for progress in Ireland now. So this may be I think it's an apt analogy. Things change, okay? People grow up. And this confessional war between Protestants and Catholics, that was really stupid to begin with. And statesmen came to Jerry, what's his name, people came to the fore here and negotiated, and the U.S. played a decent game. Even if you want to say something good about Bush, I mean, about Clinton, and about what that fellow, Tony Blair, there in England, well, to their credit, they helped bring that thing to an end. So it takes a long time, a very long time, sometimes centuries. In this case, it's going to happen much quicker, but not quick enough for most of our tastes.
Yeah. And do you think that with the negotiations that are happening or were happening in Qatar between the head of CIA, head of Mossad, and together with Qataris, they were talking about Gaza and the situation. I believe that they want to find a solution, but how can we understand the nature of the talks that are happening between these three parties, which we know that Hamas is not part of these talks? And as long as you don't have Hamas, talking to Hezbollah is, they're talking about we're gonna accept anything that Hamas is agreeing on. And here is Hamas, the key of the conflict in Gaza, in Palestine. Do you think that the people who are talking to each other in Qatar are considering Hamas, and what are they thinking about what's going on in Gaza?
It's a charade, or as the British would say, it's a charade. Okay. Bill Burns has a new plan, right? As you point out, Hamas is not directly involved, although they are there in Doha, in Qatar, and that's why they're there. The folks there bring them into these conversations at one remove. But the whole thing could end today. And when people ask Bill Burns, why don't you just stop giving arms aid to Israel? What does he say to them? I mean, really, how do you reply to that? The whole thing could stop overnight if you do that. So Bill Burns is in a, it's a ridiculous position. And he is a policymaker. I mean, this is big. He's not only head of CIA intelligence, he's he's in the cabinet. He makes policy. So the policy is built, presumably or theoretically, on intelligence served up by the CIA. So he serves up intelligence, and to please the president, he says, "Oh, there's still a hope. Oh, yeah, we'll get those Egyptians. We'll get those Israelis. We'll find." Because after all, I'm doing it. I do this thing really well, right? So that's what he's telling the cabinet. Can you see the problem there? Heads of the CIA should never be a member of the cabinet. Burns has this special little glow about him, I guess. And, when he's been so wrong on Ukraine, when he told the president on the 6th of July last year, Putin has lost definitively. His armed forces have been shown up for ineffectual for the whole world to see. And Biden gets up in Helsinki 6 days later, says the same thing. 13th of July last year. Look it up, okay? Putin has lost, already lost, right? Well, hello. Here's the problem. Does anyone in Congress ask Bill Burns to come in and say, now, Mr. Burns, that was what, July, August, September. So that was 15, 16 months ago. What happened? I mean, what happened? Oh, did the North Koreans come in to help? Oh, no, that was just recently. Well, what happened? What's Burns going to say? Well, the problem is he's not asked those questions because Congress is submissive to the executive branch in a way that it never has been before. So the problem is there's no accountability. Burns can say Putin lost in July of last year. Now he can say Putin's about to win unless we give more blah, 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 blah in October of the following year, today, 2024. So, yeah, that's my take on Bill Burns. To the degree he's doing any good in Doha, this really depends on his credibility. And when he has no answer to the question, why don't you stop arms supply to Israel? When he has no answer to that question, then he has no credibility at all. That's my take.
And I'm glad that you mentioned the situation in Ukraine about the North Korean soldiers being in Ukraine. Ray, what's going on with this new rhetoric? We know that Russia doesn't need North Korean soldiers. And why are they talking about this in a manner that is so important? Let's talk about it. Let's discuss many issues that it seems that they were talking about. Let's bring South Korean to fight the North. It's unbelievable the level of rhetoric right now, and they're trying to manage the situation in Ukraine. Do you think that they're getting prepared to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, as we know that the situation is not that good in Ukraine right now? Their military, their army is not good right now. It's not in a good shape. What's the reason behind this new rhetoric, in your opinion?
Well, Nima, you put some very pleasant words to describe the situation in Ukraine. For Ukraine, it is not good to the nth degree. They've had very rapid reversals to the point where, if I can read maps correctly, the Russians could do a major big arrow advance to the Dnieper River far above Kherson, where they're already on the west bank of the Dnieper River very quickly, even before next Tuesday, if they so chose. Okay, I don't think they're going to do that, but that's how much they have been winning. Okay, and some U.S. generals have pretty much admitted. One of them saying, the Russians are much stronger now than they ever were before, especially in Ukraine. So how do you read all this stuff? Well, it's confusing enough. These things started with Zelensky, and I think the Financial Times and some people in the U.S., and even then comes David Sanger. Okay, he's a weather vane. He's the CIA leaky. I mean, they leak to. They give him stories. Look at what happened to WMD. Sanger said in one article back in July of 2002, 7 times weapons of mass destruction or flat fact in Iraq. Okay, so they tell him what to say, and he says it. And so they said, there'll be 3,000, maybe 10,000 coming in there. So what's the whole deal? You're right. The basic thing is the Russians don't need North Koreans in there. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean there are no North Koreans in Russia? Of course not. There are probably thousands of them in joint training with the Russians out in the Far East. Now, has a division or a battalion or a company come into Kursk, which is Russia proper, invaded by Ukraine, actually invaded by NATO because Ukraine was using all NATO weaponry. So here's a case where Putin is biding his time. He's already killed about 13,000 of those people who came into Ukraine came into Kursk from Ukraine, and he's just going to finish them off. But why would he need North Koreans to do that? He doesn't. So, is there a chance that some North Koreans would appear there? I think so, but what would that be? It wouldn't be because they're needed. It would be to advertise the fact, as Putin has pretty much done in those interviews he gave, mostly in Kazan there during BRICS, okay? What he said was, look, so there are satellite photos of North Koreans in Russia. Isn't that interesting? There might be something to that. But then he said, look, we have a mutual defense treaty with North Korea. You know what that means? Nuclear defense. Mutual defense treaty means, and the language in Article 4, says Putin, is very precise. It says when another country suffers an armed invasion from the country with which you are bound by this treaty, you are immediately required to spring to its aid with military help and all kinds of help, okay? That's the treaty we have with North Korea, okay? So if North Korean soldiers are in Kursk, well, they're fulfilling their mutual defense treaty obligations. They're coming to our help in case we need it, okay? So if you get that through your head, West, that's what this is all about. And by virtue of this treaty, should someone in the Far East try to stir up trouble against our allies, North Korea, we will be mutually obligated to come to their aid. So this has substance to it. And to the degree that these North Korean soldiers, if any, they're coming west, exist, and that would be I think the real reason here, the rhetorical or the dramatic reason to say, look, we have allies too, not only Belarus, but we have North Korea, and we have China and Iran as virtual allies. And that is another interesting thing here. The pact with Iran, the Russian-Iran treaty, 20 years now, they've been working on it almost 3 years. And earlier this year, it was said it was already now. It's going to be strategic to the nth degree. They probably wouldn't call it a mutual defense treaty as with North Korea, but it's real. It's going to be signed at BRICS, okay? And then before BRICS, all of a sudden, Pezeshkian, the president of Iran, goes to meet Putin in Central Asia a week before BRICS. And he comes back and he says, well, people said we were going to sign the treaty. Well, it's ready, but we hope that it'll be signed at BRICS. Well, for months and months, it was a done deal. It was to be signed at BRICS, but then it wasn't. Now, I'm not sure. I think the last thing I said, oh yeah, it's going to be signed pretty soon, okay? Why the delay? It seems to me that if the American military has been restraining the Israelis so as to prevent a wider regional war in that area, the Russians have been doing their part by restraining the Iranians. And the worst thing they could do would be to give them a mutual defense treaty or something tantamount to that, and give them the notion that, oh yeah, we Iranians can bloody the noses not only of the Israelis, but of the Americans, because the Russians don't want that to happen. So I saw that initially, and I think that's still true. I believe it's still to be the operative fact here as to why there is no treaty signed between Russia and Iran, because once there is, then Russia has a mutual obligation to help Iran, whether it's literally as explicit as in the North Korean-Russian treaty or not, it'll be a step toward that. And I think that's a good thing. And I further think that There is an open communication line between our Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, and what's his name, the fellow in Moscow, the defense minister there. And they're coordinating these things. And I mean, I don't know if they're coordinating, but they're in touch with each other. And my guess, and it's just a guess, is that Austin is telling Belousov, the defense minister, look, we're doing our best to restrain the Israelis. They wanted to do X, and we persuaded them to do Y. Now, would you try to work your will or try to restrain the Iranians so that if the Israelis do Y, that they don't do Y plus, that they can kind of stop the escalation? That's speculation that is not based on the kind of facts I like to use, but I think it's played a role in tampering down this thing to the degree it has been. And I did see something today where it looks like the Iranians, although they've been back and forth, they may not retaliate for the latest Israeli